Well, thank you guys very much for that. That was very appreciative. I enjoy doing these. Thank you, thank you. All right, so here is my latest YouTube video for period 4, the War of 1812. So this should be, I think, a shorter video since there's really not a lot to talk about the War of 1812. I really want to talk about its aftermath more than anything else, so we'll get right into this. Here's our key concept, which we've been talking about actually pretty much, but we're going to focus on this last part here, relations with European powers, predominantly England, but also a little bit of France. As we're aware at this time, England and France, Napoleon's France, are at war. And this has been causing a lot of trouble. In fact, this issue has been causing trouble since the presidency of George Washington. Here we are now, 4 presidents into it, and it's still a problem. Impressment, right? Taking American sailors and impressing them into your Navy. The English passed this law, Orders in Council. Basically, all you have to know is this law is trying to blockade any country from trading with France. So basically, it limits American trade. So that becomes a problem. They're impressing our sailors, and they're basically stopping all of our trade. They're also arming Native Americans. You probably have already forgotten a guy named John Jay. Your silence speaks volumes. So, yes, John Jay, who's that? But there's a treaty, Jay's Treaty, back during Washington's administration. The British promised they would leave forts in America, and they don't leave all of them. So they're using this opportunity to arm Native American tribes, and a Shawnee by the name of Tecumseh goes to war in 1809 through 1811, and it's a pretty big war. America finally wins that one, but that is a problem. So you have all this stuff is happening, and a brand new Congress has taken control. The 12th Congress has arisen. These are younger men who did not participate in the American Revolution. So these men are hot for war. They feel American pride is on the line here. They're impressing our sailors. They're stopping our trade. They're arming the Native Americans to fight against us. They want war. James Madison in 1812 is up for re-election. I've always felt that this is part of this, and I could be totally wrong, but this is a feeling of mine. This is an election year, 1812. He can definitely read the temperature of the room, as it were, that these men are hot for war, these war hawks. Young men like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, who we're going to talk a lot about over the coming weeks. So he writes a war message. He's the first president to ask Congress for a declaration of war. And he lists these reasons: impressment, orders in council, and arming Native Americans as the reason. If you're going to declare war, these are the reasons to do it. So this becomes America's first declared war. Well, what can we really say about it? Again, not really a whole lot. It really depends. Did America win it? Did America lose it? Is it a draw? I guess it depends on who's writing the history book at the time. Nothing is really gained. Nothing is really lost by the Americans. The British do invade Washington, D.C., and they burn down a lot of buildings. They set fire to the White House, although technically at the time it wasn't called the White House. That's going to be much later, but we retroact that word back to in history. So it was known as the Executive Mansion, but, all right, who cares about that? So we'll just call it the White House. They set fire to the Library of Congress. They set fire to the Capitol building. They burn a lot of buildings in Washington, D.C. Of course, when America invaded Canada, they did set fire to the Canadian capital, so I guess it was a payback. All right, so when they do invade Canada, by the way, it's a major defeat for the American forces. Fort Detroit, a big fort, an American fort. The commander there surrenders to the British really without firing a shot. He's been tricked by both the British and the Indians there that they have a much larger force coming against them than they actually do. In fact, the troops at Fort Detroit outnumbered the British and the Indians combined, but the commander was convinced that he was outnumbered, and so he surrenders. America. But we do have some victories along the Great Lakes. There are several Great Lake victories. There's also the Battle of the Thames that America wins. Fort McHenry, again, it's kind of a draw. The British come up. It's off the coast of Baltimore, Fort McHenry. So they come up the Chesapeake there, and the British fleet begins to bomb Fort McHenry. Francis Scott Key is an American aboard a British ship who was trying to negotiate for prisoner release when the bombardment began, so then he was kept as a prisoner himself. So he watched the bombardment night from the day to the night to the next day, and he noticed that the American flag was still there. And the British basically gave up the bombardment and left. But Francis Scott Key then writes the famous Star-Spangled Banner. So we get that out of this war. We also get the legend of Uncle Sam. Maybe. I mean, there's a lot of perhaps truth or myth to this, but Mr. Sam Wilson owns a meat packing factory, and he is canning meat for the American soldiers. It's coming in crates that are stamped U.S. Sam Wilson Company. So the Americans begin to joke, saying, our Uncle Sam is feeding us again. And that becomes the beginning of the legend of Uncle Sam. All right. So there you go. The War of 1812. The Treaty of Ghent, which is in the Netherlands, was signed on December 24th, 1814. So the war only lasts about 2 years. And again, nothing's really gained or really lost. The biggest battle of the war, the Battle of New Orleans, the most famous of the battles, notice when it's fought. January 8th to the 18th, 1815. So several weeks after the war was over, the Battle of New Orleans took place. Andrew Jackson becomes a major war hero because of this battle. The British Dragoons, the best of the best, will charge Jackson's line, and he will defeat the British. Basically annihilate them, making him a war hero. But that battle took place after the war. But it's the most famous battle of the war, and Andrew Jackson becomes a hero. Now, here's what I really want to get into. So, the death of the Federalist Party is going to happen. If you are aware, if you've been paying attention, I'm assuming some of you are paying attention, but the Federalists have been slowly killing themselves. Politically, that is. They've been very angry for 8 years over Thomas Jefferson and the Embargo Act. During that time, they even illegally smuggled with the British. Then you get into Madison's presidentship. In his first 4 years, there's a lot of issue with trade as well that's making the Federalists very angry. And then this war takes place that the Federalists did not support because they want to trade with the British. So on December 15th, 1814, so that's just 9 days before the Treaty of Ghent is even signed, and they meet until January 5th, they have this Hartford Convention, right? They're going to really, really attack what they think the Federalists have done, what the Republican Party has done to ruin them. Blue Light Federalists, during this war with British, there were some of these Federalists who would go down to the coast with lanterns with blue lights on them and help the British smuggle during the war. This is an act of treason, by the way. There's a small vocal minority that are proposing secession. They want to break away and join Canada. So that's what this Hartford Convention is going to start off about. Thankfully, the majority of Federalists do not want to join Canada, and they're able to put that down. But during this time, they come up with a list of grievances. They want financial support for all lost trade going back to Jefferson's embargo. They want an amendment to the Constitution. This amendment will state you need a 2/3 vote whenever you're going to vote for new states to enter the Union. If a president ever wants to do another embargo act, you need a 2/3 vote in Congress. If the president wants to declare war, you need a 2/3 vote in Congress for that. They also want to get rid of the 3/5 clause because they're tired of all the electoral votes that the South has because of this. And they call for a one-term president. Now, all of this takes place in Hartford, Connecticut, December 15th through January 5th. They don't know that the war is over. They also do not know that Andrew Jackson is about to win one of the largest battles of this war. They send two schmoes. We really don't know exactly who they were. These two guys go to Washington. They don't get there till February. They don't realize that the entire city is celebrating the end of the war. They're celebrating Andrew Jackson's victory. They still go before Congress, and they're going to list these grievances. It is said that James Madison was sitting in a balcony listening, And as he's hearing these grievances, he began to laugh out loud. When that happened, all clout of the Federalist Party fell apart. People began to realize that the Federalists are really being ridiculous. People begin to leave the party begins to fall apart. They'll run another election in 1816, but that will be their last election. The Federalists are basically now ruined because of this. But the Republicans also do something silly during the war. Remember how they felt about banks? No banks.
An enemy has been slain.
Yes, they've gotten rid of an enemy. The First National Bank of Alexander Hamilton, it had a 20-year charter from 1791 to 1811. So in 1811, it went before Congress to be rechartered. Jefferson's no longer President of the United States at the time, but he always felt there was no need for a national bank. So now Madison is president, and his administration refuses to renew this charter. So there's no bank. 1811, the bank goes away. Yay, we're all happy, no more bank. And then the War of 1812 happens. And this is a quote from the Secretary of the Treasury. He went to Madison in 1813, about a year into the war, and he said, "We have hardly enough money to last to the end of the month." They began to realize very quickly that you need a national bank for things like war. You need to establish credit. You need to have a unified form of currency. You need to regulate all the state banks. You need to raise money to feed the troops, clothe the troops, transport the troops, give them weapons. How are you going to have any of this if you don't have a national bank to help pay or establish credit for you? This becomes a major problem. And Madison will realize he's going to have to deal with it after the war. Which then brings us to this key concept here. And the market revolution is about to begin. Key concept 4.2, Roman numeral 2, letter D. We're introduced to the American system. I'm going to talk more about this in class to get an idea, but it comes out of what is known as the 7th annual message. Today, the President of the United States, in our time period, he gives the State of the Union address. In their time period, they gave what's called the annual message. They would give it at the end of the year. The State of the Union is now done at the beginning of the year. This 7th annual message of James Madison's presidency becomes known as the Madison Platform. Look for some of the things he calls for. He wants a uniformed national currency. Wow. He calls for a new national bank, which in 1816, they will charter another 20-year bank. These Jeffersonian Republicans will bring back the bank. They also realize that because of the War of 1812, our industry begins to grow. Textiles, iron works are starting to emerge. An iron industry is emerging. A wool industry is emerging. We must protect that industry from foreign competition. So they bring back protective tariffs, which Southerners hate. You raise my taxes, you're coming after my slaves. But they raise the tax. And they begin to call for what we call internal improvements. There were no roads. The army was trying to march into battle, and they had to go through the woods. There were no roads to get them there. They also want to build canals to interlink between major rivers. All of this is very Hamilton. This is very Hamilton.
Awesome!
Yes. So here we start to see a change with some of these Jeffersonian Republicans, which brings us into the election of 1816. Madison doesn't run. He's run his 2 terms. James Monroe, the last of the Revolutionary War heroes. He will be a 2-term president. He is a Virginian, part of the Virginian dynasty. We call this the era of good feelings because the Federalist Party died. And now we're supposed to only have one political party. But Jeffersonian Republicans are a divided party. National Republicans emerge, those who want the bank, those who want internal improvements, those who want to create, a unified form of currency. They want state colleges, for crying out loud. And then the Democratic Republicans emerge, those who want to hold on to states' rights and liberty and not order, right? They want to hold on to their way of life. And this party eventually is going to be split into two new parties. The Democratic Party will emerge, the one you know today, and a party known as the Whigs will emerge. And that's where we're going to get to Andrew Jackson and Henry Clay and the great battles that we're going to talk about that those two men are going to have. Well, that's it for this. But I want to remind you, you got to go to page 222 and 230 and do some reading. You have a question and answer on page 233, The War of 1812 and the Transformation of Politics. And there's our good friend Madison. All right, guys, that's it for me. Have a good night. Bye-bye.